In Galatians, Paul's been showing his readers that justification before God comes through faith and not through the works of being obedient to the law. Righteousness before God comes from faith and not from the works of the flesh. In continuing to make this point in chapter 4, he goes on to tell an allegory about the story between Hagar and Sarah. So, what is going on here? An allegory was a Jewish style of argument in the first century, which was meant to show a deeper spiritual meaning behind a passage of Scripture. It's likely that the Judaizers who were coming in and deceiving some people in the church were using this style of argument to demonstrate that they had a deeper understanding of Scripture than Paul. As Paul was a trained Pharisee under the respected rabbi named Gamaliel, he was no doubt well versed in this style of argument and using Scripture in this way. So when they used an allegory to make an argument, they weren't denying the historical truthfulness of the stories themselves, but this was a way to show a deeper spiritual lesson behind a well-known Old Testament story. So what is his point with this allegory in Galatians 4? Paul sees a parallel to the current situation he is addressing in the Galatian church with the actions of Abraham after God had promised him that he would have a son. On the one hand, you have this idea of walking in faith in God, and on the other hand, there is this idea of walking in the works of the flesh in order to help yourself and really God along in completing his purposes. In the story of Abraham, God promised that he would have a son, even though his wife Sarah was well past her childbearing years. As time went on, however, Abraham decided that if he wanted to inherit the promise of God, he would need to do it through works. Because of this, he had a child with his slave girl Hagar. Now, the child that resulted of that was not the promised child of God, because for that child, Abraham relied on his own works and not on God. When Abraham and Sarah had a child in their old age, this was a miraculous act of God, and this was the child that God had promised. In the same way, this is how justification works before God. We can't help it along through our own works and make ourselves more righteous or justified before Him. Relying on the works of the law for justification before God is like following Abraham's example with Hagar. This doesn't inherit the promise of God, but the only thing it inherits is slavery to unfruitful and never-ending works. On the other hand, relying on faith for justification is like following Abraham's example with Sarah. This has full faith and trust in the promise of God that He will justify us through Christ. What is inherited from this is freedom to live out the calling of God in our lives, and we're obedient to Him out of a motivation that stems from love.